Thanks, Jerry, and welcome to all 84 of you that joined us. Leave it to Ed Cope to bring us a nice crowd, so we appreciate that, Ed. Ed Cope is a restoration ecologist with 12 years of experience managing natural areas. He graduated from Montana State University with degrees in land rehabilitation and wildlife habitat management. He worked as an ecologist with the Natural Land Institute for 4.5 years. And like Jerry, I got to spend some time in the field with him. Ed is not only an extraordinary botanist, but he's an ecologist who looks at the whole picture, not just the plants, but the soil organisms and the insects and the birds and everything. So he's just to spend time in the field with Ed is a good experience. It's a good learning experience. So, and now he's going to share some of that wisdom with us. Ed now serves as a plants program manager for the Coos Watershed Association in Coos Bay, Oregon. And again, this is being recorded. So if you miss part of it or have to leave early, it will be on the Wild Ones website. And I think that that link was posted. We'll handle any questions via chat at the end. There might be some time where you can converse with Ed as well, but we'll try and monitor the chat to answer any of the questions that come up at the end of Ed's program. And now I'll mute myself and stop my video and turn it over to Ed Cope. Thanks, Ed, for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for showing up, everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar names all in one Zoom room. Wish I could see you in person. Just coming down with a case of the sniffles, so bear with me. Pumped myself full of nasal decongestant half an hour ago, so hopefully get through this okay, but might have to take a break for a drink here or there. I'm gonna start sharing my screen here. Okay, so I'm calling this presentation Last Chance to See, the Vanishing Flora and Fauna of Gravel Prairies. When I was first approached to do this talk, the focus was requested to be on Bell Bowl. And the first thing that came to mind for me at Bell Bowl is there's a few species of plants there that I never have seen anywhere else. They, one time might have been more common across the region, but Bell Bowl is the last place that I know they exist in Winnebago County and possibly the whole region. So with the impending threat of destruction, that was just at the forefront of my mind, just how grateful I was to be able to go find these plants and just be able to experience the joy of being in their presence. Something, even if the worst happens and we lose the prairie, I'll have those those memories that I'll absolutely cherish. And it reminded me of this book by Douglas Adams, of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. But he wrote another book, nonfiction work, called Last Chance to See, where he had heard about all these endangered species that were on the brink of extinction. And he's not an ecologist or anything, but he was reading about some of these organisms and he just thought, wow, those are amazing. I gotta go see those before they're gone. Once they're gone, there's no chance of ever looking at them again, other than maybe a stuffed mountain museum. And just thinking of the broader context of these gravel prairies, they're home to an inordinate number of rare and imperiled species. Some, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Others, they're not doing so hot. And so I thought it'd be just kind of fun to take a little tour around Winnebago and the surrounding counties and just look at some of these gravel prairie species that are kind of in the same boat. You know, this is your last chance to see them. Like I said, some of them are doing good. They take well to restorations, and hopefully they'll be on the landscape for thousands of years to come. But others, yeah, I want to share my experiences tracking some of them down. It was, a years long effort to find some of these plants. And yeah, I'd like to maybe give you a bit of a blueprint to go find them yourself if you want the opportunity to see them in your lifetime. With that in mind, I think a sensible place to start is just to make sure we're all on the same page, what I mean by a gravel prairie. So there's this tendency when we're thinking about communities and ecosystems to kind of define them through the lens of the vegetation that's there. Yeah, that makes sense. It's the skin of the earth. And then you're walking through a field, that's what you see is the vegetation. If you spot a swamp milkweed, that ground, even if it's not wet right now, it gets soupy sometimes. And yeah, that's true for gravel prairies too. If you're at the top of a hill and you are surrounded by pasque flowers and prairie smoke and side oats grama, and all the vegetation is 3 feet high, even this big stuff, big blue and Indian grass that down at the bottom of the hill is 6 feet tall. The top of the hill, it's only waist high. That's a pretty good indicator that you are standing in a gravel prairie. But that's not the full story. There's something going on beneath the surface that is putting some strong pressures on what can grow in these environments. And that secret sauce is gravel. This picture came from Minnesota. A helpful burrowing mammal has penetrated the skin of the earth and excavated all this wonderful gravel. Growing up, my parents lived on this hilltop east of Roscoe, and God, we just dreaded doing any yard work because if you had to dig a hole, it meant 6.5 hours to go 12 inches deep. It was just rubble, and that is what these gravel prairies are based on. This substrate on which they're growing provides, or it's creating some pretty serious constraints on what can grow there and how these communities are structured. There's two main factors going on here. Number one, they tend to be really well drained. What do I mean by well drained? If you take a 5-gallon bucket, drill some holes in the bottom, and you fill it with this gravel material, you take another bucket, put some holes in it, fill with potting soil, and put a hose on each one, you're going to have a good trickle of water coming through the gravel bucket in about 25 seconds. The potting soil bucket is going to take a couple minutes before it starts oozing out the bottom. You leave them out in the sun, that gravel bucket will be dry in a day. Potting soil bucket, 3, 4, 5, 6 days before it dries out completely. These soils are so rocky, they just do not hold on to water very well. So it is dry, at least compared to other prairies. As the crow flies, might not even be that far away. The other factor is nutrient availability. Nutrient dynamics drive so much of what we see in community structures. So just think about, if you have a plant that has died, as its body decomposes, you have this soluble nitrogen that when we get a big rain, then nitrogen will dissolve into that water and it will become available to plants. But in the gravel prairie, that water, it drains away really quick into the deep strata beyond the reach of the plant roots. In a more mesic, black soil situation, that soil is more of a sponge. That dissolved nitrogen, it hangs in the soil profile longer. It adheres to these, more clumpy soil particles, and it just gives plants and soil microorganisms more time to access that nitrogen. And so that's the other big factor we need to think about. These systems are nutrient limited. And this really explains a lot of what you're seeing in not just gravel prairies, but all prairies, really. I don't want to get on too much of a tangent here. I could talk about nitrogen all day. But if you ever have a prairie that's misbehaving, probably 50% of the time, there is an undiagnosed nutrient dilemma. You ever wonder why like big blue or Indian grass sometime become hyper dominant in reconstructed prairies? It might be the seed mix you chose. It probably has something to do with excess nitrogen. If you ever wonder why some of these remnants after a burn just explode with sumac, it's nitrogen. You see well-intentioned managers who can't abide a woody plant in their prairie, hammer that 5 years of successive fire trying to burn that sumac away. It only makes the problem worse. You're just freeing up this nitrogen that the plants that want to live there are adapted to low nitrogen conditions. So that is things to keep in mind for gravel prairie. They're dry, they're nutrient limited, and as a result, the vegetation tends to be short-statured and sparse in comparison to more mesic tall grass prairie situations. Now it creates an interesting dilemma. If we're trying to restore a gravel prairie, there's not gravel everywhere. A mesic prairie restoration, any old farm field's pretty much the same. You can grow that anywhere, but gravel is sporadic on the landscape. So if we're thinking about, maybe doing a salvage from Bell Bowl, there's only specific places where you can put these plants where they're going to thrive. They need this gravel environment. This is what they are adapted to. So let's consider for a moment where the gravel comes from, because understanding the geologic context is going to help us understand the biota. We're going to talk about the climate too a little bit. That also has helped assemble these communities, but a little geologic context first. So 540 million years ago, Illinois was underwater. It was underwater for about 200 million years, and it was equatorial. So we had this shallow tropical sea in which we had all these wonderful creatures like coral and bryozoans and diatoms and mussels, and all these organisms build their hard parts, shells and skeletons, out of calcium carbonate. Over time, these organisms die. Those shells and skeletons accumulate on the bottom of the ocean floor, and they break down and they partially dissolve and they compress under their own weight. And over millions of years, that becomes limestone. And so for a long time, this is what we had in Illinois, was just limestone. So the area uplifted and dried out, became a terrestrial environment. And there was weathering and erosion that cut gorges and gullies and spectacular rock formations. But when dinosaurs were roaming Illinois, they were treading on limestone. If you go to the driftless area, which is never glaciated, southwest Wisconsin, northwest Illinois, that is what Illinois looked like for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, from 325 million years ago up to almost the present day. And then something big happened. The glaciers arrived. Continental glaciers, thousands of feet thick, advanced from Canada, and then they retreated when the climate warmed and advanced again and retreated. And this happened cyclically for almost 2 million years. And when these huge glaciers advanced, as they were coming south, they were scraping the surface of the earth, and they were picking up rock and rubble and big boulders, and it was transported south. And then as they melted, all that rock dropped out and remained. So the photos here is what it looks like when a montane glacier does this. A continental glacier, being thousands of feet thick rather than hundreds, these gravel piles that were left behind were an order of magnitude larger. These gravel deposits can be hundreds of feet thick in some parts of the state. And so this is where all of our gravel came from. Rubble that was brought by continental glaciers and then dropped off here in these kind of long structures called moraines. There's other glacial formations too, but moraines are far and away the most common you'll come across here in northern Illinois. And about 15,000 years ago, the glaciers receded for the last time, and this is where we need to start thinking about what the climate was doing. So many of you are probably familiar with this concept of glacial relic species. So like 13,000 years ago, the last period of glaciation, end of the Ice Age, Illinois was pretty cold. The climate was similar to, central Canada. And so we have species, which we think of as more northerly species that existed here as common components of the flora. And then as the climate changed and warmed, these species retreated northward. But small pockets of suitable habitat remained. And so even as the bulk of the population retreated hundreds or thousands of miles northward, there were little areas where they might persist. Think about Canada yew. That's a common understory species. You go to northern Minnesota, southern Canada, you see Canada yew everywhere in the woods. Down here, it's only growing on these steep, deeply shaded cliff sides where in the hottest day of the summer, it's barely getting above 70 degrees there. Or Volo bog. Think about all these wonderful bog species. Again, super common as you go north. Tamaracks and all these wonderful vacciniums. They pretty much only exist around here in the boglands around Chicago and nowhere else. And then there's this delightful little snail, Iowa Pleistocene snail. They found fossils for this elsewhere in North America, dating back 40,000 years. This was probably a relatively common species at one time across the whole region. But as the glaciers retreated, there's only a few spots now where they can persist. It's these algific talus slopes in the driftless area. Really cool habitat. I'd encourage you to read up on it. But there's a lesser known phenomenon that explains much of our gravel prairie flora. So instead of glacial relic species, we have what are known as hypsothermal relic species. So these are species that are relics not from the Ice Age, but from a warm period, the hypsothermal period that happened a few thousand years later. So just follow these arrows. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. 13,000 to about 10,500 years ago, we had spruce forests. We know this from pollen in lake sediment cores that have been sampled. We start with spruce forest, and that's kind of this big blue wedge down the lower left hand of the graph. And then as things warm up, we transition to like this oak, pine, woodland. And then we hit 9,000 years ago. We're starting to see some red on the graph. This is like where the prairie species start to come into the show. It was still like mixed oak woodland, but some prairie forbs and grasses showing up. And then we hit this really warm period from about 7,000 to 3,000 years ago. This graph calls it the Holocene climate optimum. I've always known it as the hypsothermal period. This was the hottest and driest time in recent history. And this was the greatest extent of prairie vegetation in North America. Pretty much all the woods around here would have retreated, maybe some things left in river corridors, but we were pretty much a vast open prairie, much like what you see further west. You go west of the Mississippi, all the trees disappear. That's probably what Illinois looked like during this warm period. And then as we get closer to the modern day, we see some, dips down in cooler temperatures, and we get back to this, mostly prairie, but there's some oak savanna, there's some riparian forests. The prairies retreated a little bit, but we did have about 4,000 years where it was very hot and dry, and the climate was more similar to what we see in the Western Great Plains. Not coincidentally, much of our gravel prairie flora are relics from this warm period. The core of their range is the Great Plains. And at one time when it was hot and dry here, their range expanded. They were probably common and widespread across the Midwest. Then as things cooled off, they retreated, and they could only live in these select little pockets of just primo habitat that remained dry enough for them to persist. That's gravel prairie. It's the only spot on the landscape that's dry enough. They don't like it in the mesic prairie where the grass is 10 feet tall and their roots get wet and rot. They need gravel prairie. Gravel prairie, being kind of sparsely distributed on the landscape, means that all these species are kind of living on islands. And so it's very difficult for, say cross-pollination to happen. So you hit these genetic bottlenecks. If the islands start to disappear, it's much harder for these species or these populations to interact with other populations. So a lot of our gravel prairie species are very sensitive to habitat loss, because once these populations start dropping away, it's really hard for them to continue to produce viable seed and maintain themselves. So that explains why we have so many rare and endangered species occupying gravel prairie. They're kind of, the last remains of, an ancient climate that no longer persists here. And they're hypersensitive to disturbance because they are restricted to very select areas on the landscape. So there is an interesting trend that's more visible on some range maps than others. The lime green colors are counties in which the species is found. Oh, and the yellow is as well. But if you look at the range maps for these, common, well, the painted cup is not common, but prairie smoke and pasque flower, we think of as characteristic elements of gravel prairies. Look at these range maps. The core of the range is out west, and then we have this unusual stripe that cuts through, north and east, sections of the Dakotas and down through Iowa and Minnesota and just into Wisconsin and Illinois. That roughly follows the extent of glaciation in North America. So you have these moraines that were deposited here by glaciers that form these, gravel beds on which these Western species can still thrive today. Now, the extent of the drift goes beyond what the range of these species is. The fact of the matter is, when you get too far south, too far east, it's just too wet. Doesn't matter how much gravel you have, it's just too wet and cool for these species to persist. So it's not a perfect, one-to-one overlay, but the distribution of glacial drift, it explains a lot of what we see in the present day distribution of these species. So, as I mentioned, as we destroy these habitats, we make it very hard for these populations to persist. And there are a lot of reasons why we have destroyed these habitats. These quarries are really valuable. There's tons of, valuable rock in them, and it's easily accessible. It's usually this nice little hill that's just really easy to quarry away off the surface of the earth. Hilly terrain, like my parents' house. It was a beautiful place to live. You're perched up on this hill, you got great views. It's a good place to build roads. Hard to build a road bed through a wetland, expensive to put a bridge over a stream. So if you can, contour your road to follow, as a gravel ridge top, hey, that's, it makes economic sense. But you can't recreate this geology. If we need to salvage plants from Bell Bowl, it's just, there's only so many places they can go, and they're becoming rarer and rarer on the landscape. These rocky soils make it really difficult to transplant things too, because it just doesn't have the cohesion that like a nice mesic soil does. And these ecosystems are just really hard to reproduce. Those nutrient dynamics I was talking about, they're very complex, very dynamic. And if you have a species that needs kind of short-statured neighbors to compete. It's just really hard to capture nowadays. We have not cracked the code on how to restore these habitats super effectively. I've seen some pretty good ones, but nothing quite matches the remnant conditions. So these kinds of prairies, more so than others, are worthy of conservation. I mean, any remnant prairie destroyed is a tragedy, but the fact of the matter is, we can probably replant a mesic prairie somewhere else. We can salvage those plants. They will thrive and be happy somewhere else. It's the last thing we want to do, but it can be done. Trying to salvage gravel prairie is next to impossible. Not to be a downer. Let's talk about some of the wonderful species that are still here and you can go find. I'll try to point you to the easiest places to go see them. Many of them are still thriving and happy in Winnebago County or the surrounding area. There might only be 1 or 2 places where they still live, but there are still healthy populations there. So the first one I want to talk about is this Aegolinus aspera, rough false foxglove. This is a really short-statured, late-blooming, annual, short-lived perennial. Hard to say. It's a hemiparasite, means it extracts some of its nutrients from its neighbors. They are capable of photosynthesizing on their own, but they have these special structures on their roots that help them tap into the root systems of neighboring plants, and they siphon off water and nutrients. This is a species that I had looked for a long time. The record is pretty sparse on them in the area. There weren't a lot of places to go check out. A lot of the habitat had been destroyed. One day, I'm walking around at Harlem Hills, and they have a burn break that they've mowed right down the middle of the prairie. And what do I see? The whole stripe of the burn break is just dotted with these enormous pink blooms. It's a very small plant, but the blooms are comically large for the size of the plant. That burn break they had been maintaining for many years, and that mowing regime was creating just the right conditions for this false foxglove to bloom. I didn't find it anywhere else in the preserve, but I started poking around all the burn breaks out there, and sure enough, there was false foxglove growing in almost all of them. Who knows, historically, what would have recreated those conditions? Maybe grazing animals. Maybe that's why this species has disappeared from so many of our other remnants. It's just reliant on a disturbance factor that is not really present anymore, at least not reliably. So that's something to think about as we manage these prairies. If we have false foxglove, or we want to introduce it, maybe we need to think about, in addition to a burning regime, maybe we need to introduce a mowing regime or a grazing regime. Maybe that will help foster some of these plants that have been very difficult to keep on the landscape otherwise. Next up is Carolina anemone. It's a very early bloomer. It's a long-lived perennial, but let's call it a very patient plant. It exists most of the time, as you see down below, just this little nondescript cluster of leaves. And I have yet to see a significant bloom. These grow at Bell Bowl Prairie. It's the only place I know about in the area where they still persist. There's other reports from other prairies long ago. I think they're pretty much all destroyed at this point. Bell Bowl really is the last place to see these. In Winnebago County for sure, possibly in the region. But at Bell Bowl, I returned for several years in a row and was able to find 1 or 2 blooms that were popping up. This is another one where I wonder if a good burn, a good mow, some mild disturbance factor is what would stimulate the conditions for this to really take off. This is what I'm worried about. If Bell Bowl is destroyed, these are right in the path of where the road is supposed to go. The only way these are making it out alive is with a salvage. So these are, I consider, some of the most imperiled plants in Winnebago County. Dragon wormwood. This is state endangered. This is a happier tale. It was almost lost from Winnebago County. Used to be somewhat common. You could find reports of it growing all up and down the Kishwaukee and the Rock Rivers. And then, as we see with many of these gravel prairie species, it, kind of started to drop out of the ecosystems. Even when the prairies were still there, I'd go walk around and look for dragon wormwood, and it wasn't present on the site anymore, even if the prairie was still intact. They must be, somewhat sensitive to, habitat loss or disturbance. Maybe it's the pollinator factor. There's just not enough fresh genetics being mixed up. But there was one place where they still persisted, Norman Jensen Forest Preserve, on a bluff right over the Rock River. There's a relic population there that had not disappeared yet. And over the years, some careful propagation has really helped this plant along. It's growing elsewhere throughout Jensen Forest Preserve now. There's a few clumps of it growing over in Nigern wetlands too. And it seems to take well to restorations. I've grown it a few times now from seed. It seems to take off well. The plants survive when you plant them in restorations. So I think this is one that has a shot. Yeah, if restoration practitioners continue to harvest the seed and integrate it into their plantings, I think this is one that could easily recover and maybe even be taken off the state endangered list. This seems like low-hanging fruit in that regard. Next up is woolly milkweed. This is the plant that I probably spent the longest searching for, probably 7 or 8 years. It used to grow in almost every gravel prairie around. Seemed to be a pretty consistent element, probably never common. The places where it still grows, it's kind of thin on the ground. It's not like walking through a patch of common milkweed where the stuff is just everywhere. It might be there's one plant here and then one plant over there. And then on the next hill, there's a couple other plants. It's kind of thinly distributed, but it was a consistent characteristic element of these gravel prairies. These are plants that we know have a significant genetic bottleneck. They need a genetically distinct partner in order to set viable seed. If all their neighbors are too closely related, the seed is just no good. So this is one that, all these sites that I've gone back and checked on, it's not surprising that they've disappeared. If there's only a couple plants there to begin with, they probably did not have the ability to set viable seed, which is a real shame because this is one of the most interesting species of milkweed out there. The vegetation is almost fuzzy and it grows real prostrate, kind of creeps along the ground. It does not look like your typical milkweed. But I was lucky enough to see it at a couple of forest preserves in Ogle County owned by the Byron Forest Preserve District. It's pretty sensitive. I don't want to give away too much, but Bald Hill Prairie Preserve is publicly accessible. You can go take a look out there. There's a few plants that I thought were pretty easy to find. It was a real joy to finally come across these after years of searching. I'm pretty sure it's all gone from Winnebago County now, though. I just never able to turn up anything. Kitten tails, another success story. State threatened. They were doing pretty rough in Winnebago County for a while. There's several populations that persist, but they were kind of dwindling and diminishing over time. And then we started to burn some of these prairies again, starting in the 90s, and their populations just took off in some places. If you go to Stonebridge Forest Preserve now, along Stonebridge Trail, there are thousands of these. Most years, you probably won't see much, but after a burn, oh my goodness, the whole hillside is just covered with these little creamy yellow blossoms, and they're fleeting. You got to go out there at the right time to see them. But it's just a really charming plant, and it's been very encouraging to see how well these have responded to management and restoration. Before I left Illinois, the last planting I did incorporated a lot of seed from these guys, and I haven't been able to get back and see how they're doing, but the quantity of seed that we're able to collect now, it's really encouraging. Knock on wood, I think this is one that could really bounce back. Downy yellow painted cup, another state endangered species, another hemiparasite. These Castanea species are just fascinating. It's kind of become a domain of expertise for me. I could wax eloquently about Castanea all day. But these were almost lost from Winnebago County. To the best of my knowledge, there were only a handful of plants that remained, kind of tucked away in a secret spot at Harlem Hills and Nachusa grasslands. Really took the ball and ran with this. They had a population down there, and they started amplifying it, and now they have plantings that are just loaded with this stuff. It seems to take very well to restorations. So again, one of the last things I did before leaving Illinois, I went down to Nachusa and begged begged for some seed, and they sent me away with a nice baggie of it and planted it at Burr Oak Valley. And from what I've heard, it's taking off there too. So easiest viewing is down at Nachusa grasslands, but my sources tell me that Burr Oak Valley is about to become a place that is loaded with this species as well. It's really heartening to hear. So many of these species that are on the cusp of extinction, they need a little bit of a push. We just, figure out the right thing to do with them, and they take off with a little bit of management. We were able to pull them back from the brink. Hills thistle, inarguably the most beautiful flower on the prairie. I will not entertain debate on that. These are just the deepest magenta hue. It is always a joy to come across them in bloom. Formerly state threatened. Looks like in 2020 they took them off the list, and with pretty good reason. These are not as rare as once believed. These are ones that, again, just suffered from a lack of management. They're monocarpic, meaning they flower one time and then they die. But they might persist for many, many years before they flower. I have seen unmanaged prairies that have just a carpet of Hills thistle rosettes biding their time, just waiting. And I've seen prairies where the management has picked back up and they roll one fire through there, and it's just an explosion of these purple blooms. And they are pollinator magnets. This is one that would be awesome to start getting into restorations. And I know people have been trying, and success has been mixed. It's easy enough to get seed and get it to come up in your planting, but the populations are just really swingy over time. That's just the nature of being monocarpic. You have one bad year, if everybody blooms at the same time and there's a bad outbreak of seed-eating insects, you're kaput. So again, this is one that, historically was probably reliant on having, kind of this archipelago of gravel hill islands. And, if one had a bad year, well, the seeds could just, float on the wind and repopulate moving forward. So again, these are ones that I'm hopeful for. I think we'll crack the code on these eventually. But in the meantime, you can go to Harlem Hills. I've seen them blooming there every year that I was exploring out there. One of my favorite species to go track down. Prairie dandelion, state endangered, one of the state's rarest plants. I know of a single individual at Bell Bowl Prairie. I found it in 2017, I think. And prior to that, it had not been seen since, I think, 1977. This is one that this really is your last chance to go see it. It's another one that's right in the path of the road. And with only one individual remaining, who can say how long it was even going to persist out there? But this is quite honestly a spectacular plant. As with many gravel prairie species, it's short statured and you kind of got to get on your hands and knees to appreciate it. But the leaves, they have these wavy margins that look like they're frosted. They have so many hairs that help with water retention, reduces evapotranspiration. It's an adaptation for where they grow further west. I've seen these growing in, like high desert situations, sagebrush. And the ligules have these deep purple lines to them that contrast beautifully with the yellow petals. This is a show-stopping plant. And it is such a shame that it's on the cusp of disappearing. And I'm sure there's probably a couple other places where it persists in Illinois, but this might be the last spot in the region. I've talked to a lot of other land managers in the area, and no one else knows where this grows. There might be, an IDNR biologist out there who's, they got a little secret spot. But as far as I know, Bell Bowl is the last place. You got to go to Wisconsin or cross the Mississippi to go see these. Again, this is like the Carolina anemone, one of the two species that I am most worried about losing from the region. Large flowering penstemon. This is a controversial one. State endangered. However, look at how beautiful those are. They're showstoppers. People love to plant these. If you buy just, like a generic prairie mix from Prairie Moon Nursery, pretty good odds that they're going to throw this in because people love it. And it's super easy to grow. So there's a lot of populations around here that are of dubious origins. It's, theoretically, part of an old home site, or coming up along an old wagon route. We just can't say with any degree of certainty whether some of these populations are the real McCoy, if they are truly Illinois genetics, or if they were brought from further west by pioneers who just really loved the blooms and they wanted to plant them around their home. Bell Bowl, we'll talk about this in a little bit. Bell Bowl is very unusual. It has a lot of species that were brought from further west. We know that for a fact. This grows at Bell Bowl. Was it there historically, or was it brought by cavalry moving hay and horses? Who can say? Without genetic analysis, it'll remain an open question. But there is a population over at Wilson Prairie near Pecatonica. Those are almost certainly genuine Illinois penstemons. It's a really high quality gravel prairie over there. That's exactly the kind of habitat we would expect to see these in east of the Mississippi. Prairie buttercup, another species that I sought for many, many years. There's all kinds of records. It used to grow in all these different gravel prairies around Rockford. It's just gone. I can't find it anywhere. I looked high and low. And then one day I'm walking around at Rock River Prairie, which is just north of the border. Excuse me. And I see this unusual buttercup. Take a close look at the leaves. It has these, what we call dimorphic leaves. The basal leaves are kind of these big spoon-shaped leaves. And then growing up the stem are these, little wiry, skinny leaves. I'd never seen a buttercup like that before. And turns out it was my long sought prairie buttercup I think this is one that's probably gone from Illinois, or not Illinois, from Winnebago County, state endangered. There's a few other populations that I know do still persist further west of Winnebago County, but Winnebago seems like it's totally gone. If you want a chance to see these, head up to Beloit, Rock River Prairie. Might help to look after burn. These are really tiny. They bloom very early, and they're not very conspicuous. I was standing right over them talking to somebody for several minutes before I looked down and noticed these. Kind of, serendipitous to find them that way. Oh, that's apparently the last of the plants I want to talk about. I have some insects and mammals we can talk about too, but I want to discuss Camp Grant, which was at the Rockford Airport grounds. Bell Bowl Prairie, in specifically, was used by Camp Grant, which operated from 1917 to 1946, so World War I and World War II. Bell Bowl served as a remount station, basically where they held and took care of horses and mules before shipping them overseas. World War I was kind of the last hurrah for the cavalry. It became apparent pretty quickly that tanks and mechanized military units were far superior to cavalry. And so most of these horses never went over to the European theater. But in the lead up to that, we had 5,000 horses and mules that arrived at Camp Grant. And this quote down below, I pulled from a history book, just talking about how, at first it looked like, oh, maybe we're going to get, pulled into the war, maybe 1 million men. And then that figure jumped to 2 million, and eventually 5 million men were going to go overseas. And we needed to field 100 or 1 million horses to accompany them. And so it was kind of a mad scramble to find horses from anywhere and everywhere in the continental US. And they rode by rail to these remount stations dotted across the country. Camp Grant was a big one. 5,000 horses coming from all over the nation, not just by rail. This photo down here shows a team of 50 mules heading to a remount station in Kentucky. Like I said, it was a mad scramble trying to field this military force as quickly as we could. And so in that jumble, a lot of vegetation inadvertently moved along with these animals, usually in the form of hay for bedding, for feed. Bell Bowl Prairie was also a site where they were practicing trench warfare. And so they would assemble these trenches out of hay bales. And so that hay was mostly coming from further west, the Great Plains. And accompanying that hay was all of these interesting species, which are not native here, but are botanically interesting. And these don't have the same pressing conservation issues as all these endangered species I just talked about, but they are part of the flora now, and they are interesting to think about. They persist at Bell Bowl and pretty much nowhere else. In some cases, nowhere else in the state. They're only ever recorded at Bell Bowl. I was looking through the notes of both Egbert and George Fell, who surveyed the area in the 50s and 60s, so not too long after Camp Grant shut down. And they found about 20 species from further west that there was no other plausible explanation for how they arrived, because they're nowhere else in the state, nowhere else in the surrounding area, but they're at Bell Bowl, right where all the horses were. Some of them are quite beautiful, like this Mexican hat I've seen down there before, sensitive briar. Some of these things have become mild invasives in their own right, like buffalo burr, which isn't pictured here, and western wheatgrass. I found these species have expanded. You'll find them throughout Winnebago County now in disturbed soils, but they're not really a problem. Um, but there's a whole little suite of species that they grow up El Bull and nowhere else. And it's not necessarily a great loss if they disappear, but they're interesting novelties. And um, it'd be kind of sad, for that history to just end right there. These are mostly harmless. They rarely produce viable seed. They just kind of persist and can keep themselves going more or less in a diminished form. But the destruction of that prairie would signal the end of about 20 species that are not likely to ever come back to Winnebago County. There's some animals too, and I've been less good about being able to track these down, but they're tied closely to gravel prairies. And if we lose this habitat, we lose these species too. So first up is this stunning regal fritillary, a state threatened butterfly. The larval hosts are two species of violet, bird's foot violet and prairie violet. You can find them in other types of habitat, but gravel prairie is their stronghold. It was probably very likely that regal fritillaries, used different kinds of habitat, but gravel prairies, where these little tiny short-statured violets could proliferate, was probably where they laid their eggs and where their caterpillars went through their metamorphosis. To the best of my knowledge, this butterfly does not live in Winnebago County anymore. Definitely used to. It was definitely quite common at one time. But I don't know of anyone who's seen one recently. They might persist. These insects have a remarkable way, much like the plants, of hanging on in just one or two little spots, maybe just a few individuals. But they have very limited dispersal capacity. The last time I talked to an expert about them, they thought half a mile, maybe a mile tops, is as far as they can fly. So again, we're thinking about these little archipelagos, these little islands of gravel prairie, dotting these moraines and ridge tops. That's probably what kept these populations going. They still persist further west. Another kind of hypsothermal relic species. They're having a hard time out there too. But if we were to get serious about reintroducing them to this area, which is probably what it's going to take to get them off the threatened species list, we need to think about preservation of gravel prairies. Similar boat, the Otoe skipper. We know it used to be here. It was probably very common at one time. Same kind of story though, very limited dispersal capacity. State endangered now. I don't think anyone has seen a living one in Winnebago County for years, maybe decades. But this is a pretty nondescript butterfly. Most people probably think it's a moth, but yeah, it's not very showy. Not like the regal fritillary, which is huge and colorful. These are like maybe 3/4 of an inch long, just kind of plain orange. But check out these larval host plants: Dichyntheliums, Leptoloma, Bouteloua. These are all short-statured grasses. You'll find them throughout all kinds of prairie habitat, but gravel prairies are where they become dominant elements of the community. So again, these butterflies were probably laying their eggs, their caterpillars were growing up, munching these short-statured grasses within gravel prairies. So preserving the prairie is the only way that we're going to get these butterflies back on the landscape. Franklin's ground squirrel, state threatened, probably gone from Winnebago County. They might even be gone from the state. There's probably a couple pockets hanging on, but I don't know anyone who's seen one in northern Illinois anytime recently. These little guys, they're kind of like prairie dogs. They like short grass, so they can stand up on their back legs and look over. check out predators. You know, historically, grazers may have provided habitat, you know, in more mesic situations. But another one, we know that they occupied gravel prairie at one time. That short grass is what they need. Lark sparrows, not uncommon. If you go, you're not going to see them everywhere, but you go to the right places during migration, you'll see these guys flying through. The first time I saw them nesting in Illinois, it was gravel prairie. It was one of these aha moments. Their nesting habitat in the state has really become quite rare. But you know, I started seeing these in the summertime. I was so accustomed to just seeing them in migration. To see them in the summer on these gravel prairies really caught me by surprise. What they do is they nest on the ground, but only at the crests of hills. They'll nest in short trees and shrubs on top of hills too, but they really seem to like that short-statured grass in which to forage. They'll forage in parking lots and lawns too. They really like open ground. But nesting at the crests of hills, I don't know what it is. They like to have that view, I guess. But they'll make a little woven nest out of grass at the tops of these hills. So we're not in danger of losing lark sparrows, but we are in danger of losing them as a nesting species. If we don't protect gravel prairies, these are just going to fly right by. Last one I want to talk about is the rusty-patched bumblebee. Federally and state endangered, Winnebago County. It's one of the last holdouts in the nations for this insect. Look at this map. The green is their historic range. The stars are where they live today. South central Wisconsin, northeast Illinois. That's their stronghold now. This is where they're making their last stand. This is the last place where you're going to see rusty-patched bumblebees for a very long time. It's going to be very difficult to recover their habitat across the rest of the range. These guys are out at Bell Bowl. I was lucky enough to find these in several places around Winnebago County. They're out there. Their habitat requirements are not very well understood. I found them in all kinds of different places. Woodlands, savannas, open prairies. One thing we know for sure though, they love foraging in gravel prairies. There's lots of plants out there that they just love to collect nectar and pollen at. So we gotta keep these gravel prairies safe for the sake of these bumblebees too. Bell Bowl, this is probably where we have the most leverage too, being that it's federally endangered. The protection of that prairie is probably going to hinge on the presence of this bumblebee out there. Time will tell how that shakes out, but this little insect is a central player in the saga of what's happening out there. I'm out of time here pretty much, so just want to leave you. I'm sure most of you already plugged into this, but check out Save Bell Bowl Prairie. They have a website, they have a Facebook group. There's lots of meetings and such that are being organized. I wish I was there. I wish I could contribute more directly to this. But those of you who are, check this out and do what you can. It's not going to get saved without your help. So
I will say you've done a tremendous service just tonight, informing us about how important these are. And I will also say the effort to defend Bell Bowl Prairie is become very expensive with legal fees. And I'm urging, if everybody on the Zoom meeting tonight would go to the Save the Bell Bowl Prairie website and then link on the GoFundMe page and contribute $10,000 or $20,000 or $10 or $20. They have a goal. We have a goal of raising $50,000, and we're only like maybe 10% there. We really need the donations, and these are all going to pay for the legal fees to fight to save the prairie. Cassie just put the website for the GoFundMe page up on chat. Want to look at that, but you can go to this Save Balboa Prairie website and get it. So we have, you want to leave this up for a minute, and Mark and I will go see if we can go through questions. I know one of the first ones, Ed, was what's the difference between a gravel prairie and a sand prairie?
Exactly what you think it might be. Gravel prairies are gravelly soils, and sandy prairies have sandy soils. If you dig down in a sand prairie, you will find pretty much nothing but sand. Some of them I've seen are like a kid's sandbox. And of course there is shades of gray. The two can intergrade. You can have these interesting assemblages of species that might occupy both kinds of prairies. Nature seldom works in these clean-cut categories, but that's the very basics of it. If you go dig a hole in a gravel prairie, you'll find a bunch of rocks. If you go dig a hole in a sand prairie, you'll find a bunch of sand.
Are the plants similar though? Because I know birdsfoot violet will grow in both.
Yes, yeah, very similar. Those factors I was talking about, being well drained and being nutrient poor, those are also at play in sandy prairies. So there is a lot of overlap, but it's not one-to-one. There's species that we think about that only grow in sand prairies, like lupin and goat's rue. And there's species like Hill's thistle that only grow in gravel prairie. I've never seen that growing in sand, at least not naturally. I've seen people plant it in sand. So there's a little bit more minutia than just dry and nutrient poor that's happening. Probably has a lot to do with soil temperatures. Those sand prairies really heat up fast, and they're really sparsely vegetated sometimes, and that can just absolutely cook some species that are not adapted to dealing with that kind of heat.
And speaking of sand prairies, Ellen says, and I've seen them there, that little sand prairie along the old railroad track at Ferguson Forest Preserve has a lot of kitten tails in it.
Yeah.
Mark, you want to take over?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you, Ed, for such an enlightening presentation. When I mentioned that plants, but you also know the whole ecology of a system, looking at the whole geology and the plants and the animals and everything that works, it was just fascinating. So, so thank you for that. One question was, there were a few Asclepias lanuginosa in a local gravel prairie. It disappeared after a drought over a decade ago. Have you seen extreme weather events lead to local extinctions? And before you answer that, I want to reiterate that you can see, folks, why the folks at NLI were sad to see Ed go. Oregon got a gem for sure. So,
thank you. I have seen drought impact species. Was it maybe 2013? We just had a killer summer, no rain for 2 months. 100 felt like 110 every day. But it's the most extreme drought that I experienced while I was working there, and there were a number of populations that I saw either contract or totally disappear. The one that comes to mind immediately was a species of Lycopodium. Struggling to remember. Shining club moss, Lycopodium clavatum. I don't recall exactly. Shining club moss used to grow at Sugar River Alder Forest Preserve. One patch, pretty good sized patch, but it got cooked that summer and never bounced back. The dragon wormwood I talked about here, I had planted several patches of that around, maybe a year before that, and they all but one got cooked. So I kind of had to start from scratch after that. Yeah, extreme weather definitely can drive local extinctions. It's kind of the danger of, putting all your, well, I mean, we're not intentionally putting all our eggs in one basket, but, when these prairies disappear and there's only 1 or 2 spots left, it's like a little lifeboat, and, the seas get too rocky and it capsizes, that's it. The number one thing we could do to help most of these species is just getting robust, populations. It doesn't have to be, population in every forest preserve that can possibly, support it. We just need a few populations that are sizable and can weather, some stochastic event like that. A bad burn, a late frost, a hot year. You might lose a whole bunch, but if there's enough growing in, enough different, micro habitats across the population to persist, that's what's going to keep these populations running long term.
Ed, what about, one question from Jason is about pH. Would the gravel prairies have a lower pH than other soils like sand prairies?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, gravel prairies tend to be neutral to slightly basic, and sand prairies tend to run neutral to slightly acidic. So that might also explain some of those differences in vegetation we see. And, those aren't hard and fast rules. I've seen exceptions to those, but that's generally what you'd expect to find.
Ed, here's a question. Are abandoned gravel road beds suitable for gravel prairie restoration efforts?
Oh, that is an interesting thought. They may be. The problem, well, there's 2 problems I see. Number one is the degree of compaction. When they build a road bed, roll it with heavy equipment to get it compacted. When you're, engineering, road bed, the last thing you want is for it to move under the weight of a vehicle. So they want it to be rock solid, just, impenetrable pretty much. So you would have to do something to break that up first, some kind of, excavator just to, kind of churn it and, allow water to percolate rather than pool on the surface. That's the key to getting the organic matter starting to accumulate. The other issue might be the kind of rock that they use. A lot of these roadbeds are made out of limestone, which we're just talking about pH. Has a pretty different pH balance, tends to be pretty strongly basic because it's made out of carbonate. So it might not support every gravel prairie species we see. Again, there's a whole other subset of prairies called dolomite prairies that grow on limestone. Tons of overlap between the species that grow in dolomite and gravel prairies, but like sand, it's not one-to-one. So yes, selectively. I don't think you could ever turn a gravel roadbed into, a perfect simulacra of a gravel prairie. But with some work, you might be able to have it support, some key species. It might actually make a really good, propagation bed if you want to, grow a whole bunch of kitten tails or something and not have much, weed competition. Like a gravel road bed is pretty sterile. You might be able to, really crank some seed production out in there. Yeah, there's some things you could do with that.
So one last question, Ed, and this is from James Hansen. He says, Ed, it's good to see you after close to 2 years. Will you inform us about what distinguishes the character of Balboa Prairie from Harlem Hills, or Wilson Prairie?
Yeah, bell bull is kind of an odd duck. Apart from the more western species I talked about that came here with the horses, there's a whole bunch of this kind of oddball species there, like switchgrass. It's not the kind of thing I would typically see in gravel prairies. You know, it's more of a wetland plant, but it grows there in some abundance, and it has for a long time. Egbert Fell noted it in his, you know, surveys of the, I think 1956 is when he published his surveys of bell bull. There's also way more June grass out there than I normally see in gravel prairies. I think it has to do with a slightly higher sand component at bell bull than other gravel prairies. That might explain the switchgrass too. But yeah, you know, each one of these prairies is, you know, kind of unique in its own way. And there's a confluence of factors that have shaped them over time. You know, the human element, you know, the kind of disturbances that might have gone on there. You know, it's amazing to me, you know, a heavy grazing regime 150 years ago might have fundamentally altered the structure of the ecosystem in ways that, you know, still ripple through time, you know, and we see them today. You know, slightly different, you know, aspect to the slope, you know, might contribute to a, you know, different suite of species that, you know, can really thrive or just barely hang on. Yeah, everyone is different. And the most wonderful thing about these hilly prairies is, you know, getting out and exploring them, because you find all these, you know, exposures and little nooks and crannies, and maybe, you know, a big glacial erratic boulder that's got some interesting plants tucked away at the base. There's so much microhabitat out there. A place like Harlem Hills, which is pretty large, it has a lot of room to go explore. The, you know, keen-eyed botanist could identify a whole bunch of different communities out there that all fall under the broad umbrella of gravel prairie, but there's a lot of variety out there. And if there's one thing I learned, a lot of these rare species live and die on that kind of minutia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just point out that people have posted a lot of good links to wildflower guides and descriptions of different habitat on the chat if you want to take a minute to look at those. Ed, you want to stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
And yeah, again, really appreciate, well, it's good to see your face, and good to know that you're doing good work out in Washington State, or Oregon, I mean, wrong state. And remind people that the program has been recorded, and it will be posted on our website. So there will probably be a link to it. I'm sure there'll be a link to it put on the State of Bell Bull Prairie website. And Cassie, maybe you can put it on the Illinois Botany website too. So thank you. We had over 90 participants signed on to the